Good evening, everybody. If it is evening where you are, it is a chilly night in South Africa, where I am talking to you today about the effects of climate change here on Sub-Saharan Africa. So what I would like to start off with is just to share the presentation with you and then highlight the key areas we're going to be looking at this evening and how these things actually impact on people here in Sub-Saharan Africa. So very quickly, just to take you through what it is that we're going to be looking at in today's presentation. We're going to be looking at the effects of climate change on Sub-Saharan Africa with a focus on food trade and the right to food. And thereafter, I want to showcase how communities are adapting to this climate change and specifically looking at a case study from here in South Africa. I think it's very important that climate change be approached not as something that's a hypothetical anymore, but that the real voices of people are heard. And I think that's what's been done so beautifully in these presentations. Also, with these presentations where the youth have been involved, I'm wanting to incorporate climate change within existing curriculums. And for that, it's really important that everybody have a understanding as to how teachers can bring these aspects into the curriculum, even when it's not explicitly instructed, which I think very few countries do. So if you're an educator logging on, then there's going to be some practical tips for you, as well as some things that the youth can be engaged in during our discussion points later on. So when we're looking at this climate change scenario, it can sometimes be quite daunting. And I wanted to specifically steer away from anything that was overly academic and really look at the voices of people here in Sub-Saharan Africa as well as their stories. But it is necessary to have some background into the research and studies that have gone into how climate change affects food trade, food production, and the right to food in the area. So one of the publications that I found on climate change and farming by Omoto and Omoteo highlighted in a really nice way all the summaries of the various studies that have taken place over the last few years. And they've bracketed this into 4 general categories. Obviously, the first thing that we look at when we think of climate change and its effect on farms is going to be the yield reduction. There's been a lot of discussion around the high temperatures we're experiencing, the changing rainfall patterns, and how that impacts on this resurgence of droughts and floods that we've had. But it's important to take a look at this and really now analyze when it comes to crops and farming, what those impacts are. And it's important to note that your rainfall patterns and seasonal growth patterns really come down to what type of crop it is that you're able to plant. So if you have plants that are used to certain weather conditions, and suddenly there are these changing temperatures and rainfall patterns, it's going to impact on your predictability of how much crop you're going to have at the end of any given season. What's important to remember is that these farmers rely on rainfall. There's very little technology that they can implement where they can now make these adaptations to, well, this is what our current rainfall and seasonal patterns are. These are the scientific and technological adaptations that we can make. They are absolutely reliant on these weather patterns. So with these shifts that we're experiencing, it's shifting this predictability of I'm planting this crop and it's going to yield this much. Obviously, this filters down to a decreased livestock productivity as well, where you have higher temperatures which are affecting the grass growth and therefore the food with which the animals can sustain themselves. Water scarcity is also a really, really big challenge because, as mentioned, these farmers are reliant on natural weather conditions. So they will herd the animals to rivers or bring water to the animals. But again, what happens when there's changes in these patterns and in the natural fall of where the rivers are having their banks? So the nourishment of the animal now comes into question, and with that is obviously added impacts on animal activism and animal rights and the well-being of these animals in the care. Interestingly enough, there's also been a surge in diseases because with the animal now being malnourished, it's not able to resist some of the diseases that it would normally have been able to do. So we're looking at not just a decrease in the crops, but also a decrease in the livestock productivity as well. Now, these farmers that we are speaking about, most often they are farming for their immediate families and for the community around them. So we're looking at small production, and whatever surplus there is then goes into trade areas and into barter, and now and again, hopefully something that they can sell as well. So going up to the top of that slide on the right, we're now looking at systems of food insecurity because that small surplus that the farmer would have been able to sell is now not available anymore. And this has a direct impact not only on the rural area, but also on the urban areas as well. And these lower crop yields can therefore cause an increase in price because now there's scarcity involved. And what's really sad to note is that the very people who used to produce these things, which is the farmer, now has to purchase them at an increased price due to the shortages, with money that they don't have because they can't sell the products that they used to. And we now begin to see this cycle of poverty that's becoming more and more evident and is very difficult to break out of. So these smallholder farmers are incredibly vulnerable to any aspects of climate change. And I know that these aspects aren't unique. There are farms everywhere throughout the world that are experiencing similar issues. But there are easier ways in which they can then pivot and adapt to that. Whereas very often in Sub-Saharan Africa, the farmers don't have the resources and the capacity to adapt to these implications. So we see that the people who are affected by climate change very early on and feel these impacts quite directly are the ones who are least able to have resources to protect themselves from the impacts of this climate change. So to put these things in a little bit of a nutshell, and again, I'm coming back to the circular motions and how people find themselves trapped in worsening conditions. So we've got point one, climate change, which is now resulting in reduced agricultural output. And what's happening is because of the rise in temperatures, because of shifting rainfall patterns, and because of more frequent droughts and floods, we now have farming that's unsustainable. And these environmental stresses are causing a disruption to harvest. They're affecting livestock and they're reducing productivity levels. This now leads to a decline in food production, and the declining crops drive up the food prices, making it harder for people to afford basic staples. Very often the things that they can afford are quite low in nutritional value, so the rate of hunger increases as well as malnutrition. A solution of sorts that people have found to this, and I say solution of sorts because it's not ideal and it's not a choice necessarily, but more something that people are being forced into, is what we refer to as rural-urban migration. And that means the movement of people from rural areas into more urban settlements. Very often, the community can't afford to send the entire family over, so it would be the strongest members of the family that move, the young children as they grow up into adulthood that are moving out, and often the men, leaving us with changes in community structure that are very different to how these traditional communities have orientated themselves. And again, we now sit with problems where this rapid rise in urban migration leads to areas that are now stuck with overcrowding. And it puts an immense strain on infrastructure and also can increase pollution levels, adding to the situation of climate change. And I say that cautiously because there needs to be an awareness that it is not the same type of consumption and production and use of resources that we might find in more developed areas. So it is a very small contribution, but it's a contribution nonetheless. As mentioned, though, the bigger aspect that we're looking at in this context is now being forced to purchase food that you once produced for yourself and that you could feed your family with. So we see how it affects not only the food trades, but also this right to food, which is something that all people should have access to. And it's very limited in terms of what solutions there are. So when we look at the moving away from kind of the more academic, data-driven things, and we're looking at what it is that people are saying, there was a 2024 publication that specifically looked at an area in KwaZulu-Natal here in South Africa. And these authors highlighted the impact of climate change, specifically looking at the respondents themselves and the words that they've used. So I wanted to highlight this because it ties together some of the theoretical components that we've been looking at to date. So the first quote reads, "We used to have predictable seasons, but now it is all unpredictable. Sometimes we experience summer-like temperatures during what should be the rainy season." Another respondent says, "We rarely receive timely warnings about extreme weather events. When floods or storms hit, it is often too late to protect our homes and crops." Another one reads, "Access to water for irrigation is a constant struggle. Our local rivers are drying up, and the cost of drilling boreholes is prohibitive for many small-scale farmers like me." There's another mention of irrigations where they say efficient irrigation systems are the need of the hour. Climate-smart irrigation methods can help us make the most of the limited water resources that we have left. Another respondent speaks to the tick-borne diseases that the cattle now have. And ticks are little insects that feed off the blood of the animals here. And we do find that when temperatures increase, it optimizes the breeding conditions of the ticks. And therefore, there's more of them in the area than there would have been under different circumstances. And this respondent mentions, "I do not have the medicine that I can use to treat it." An interesting comment as well that comes through is, "Our roads and bridges are not built to withstand extreme weather. When they get damaged, it disrupts the movement of goods and services, affecting our livelihood." There was also conversation about the fact that there's very little warning when these natural disasters are going to occur. So the response before the time in terms of prepping houses or moving animals or protecting crops is very limited. And the effect afterwards in terms of emergency services and resources is very limited. So as this respondent now says, when you have roads that are damaged, Those are the roads that these people use to travel in order to trade. So now you're sitting with a situation where you could possibly have had good crops, but you're not able to trade because you can't travel along the areas where you normally would have. And again, we see the cycles coming into play of this impacts the amount that you're going to have for your household, and therefore what it is that you can use, purchase, and consume for yourself. It's not all completely doom and gloom, though, and South Africans are a resilient people. And the report does also speak about the adaptations that this community has done in order to try and circumvent and navigate some of these challenges. And I've specifically taken the points we looked at initially and bracketed some of the adaptations under those 4 points from the previous report. So when looking at yield reduction, which is the fact that your crops are not producing the way that they used to before, this respondent said that I told my family, we can't just stick to maize for porridge anymore because the maize crops aren't doing well. So now we're trying out other crops like sorghum, and they seem to be handling the heat better. Another respondent has addressed the problems that impact livestock. And here they've used a method where they create a fire environment, almost like a makeshift incubator, using a steel drum and bricks. So they build the fire within the steel drum and they place bricks around the area where the chicken coops are. And the bricks obviously retain some heat. So during nighttime, when temperatures plummet because there's lack of clouds and you have these various fluctuations in temperature now, the egg production is not affected. Then looking at food insecurity, and this I thought was a really beautiful area to highlight, is the respondent says, if my crops are not able to yield any fruit, I know that my neighbors will support me. We support each other in this community because we all know that these things are unpredictable. And tomorrow, it could be you in the same situation. So we come together and assist each other with some veg or maize when it's really bad. And then lastly, speaking to the vulnerability of these smallhold farmers, the government support programs for us are a lifeline. They provide food and resources during times of drought and extreme weather events. And without them, many families would suffer even more. And I think that's just a testament to the fact that it is increasingly important that different stakeholders look at these areas and see how they can come together and support the communities. Because while they are going through the process of adapting and changing and finding different resources and finding solutions, it's also very difficult. And they are faced with challenges that are now almost stacked up against against them, where as soon as you find a solution for one thing, it seems like another thing is cropping up. So how do we now take all of this and we look at how can we incorporate this in our current situation? So when we look at a South African curriculum, we have something called the National Curriculum Statements. And these map out very clearly what topics should be covered in our various phases and what the subsections of those are. So for social sciences, we're looking at history and geography. They've mapped out for intermediate phase, which is our grades 4 to 6, the senior phase, which is grade 7 to 9, and the National Senior Certificate, which is grade 10 to 11, certain areas which they deem are most important to be covered during those phases of the child's educational career. And just by highlighting some of these, I'm hoping that the previous conversations start making sense here. And I would encourage that any educators who are listening does something similar where you looking at mapping out your curriculum and looking at aspects of climate change. Immediately, if I look at food and farming, there's going to be certain things that pop out at me because we've just been speaking about all of these now. When we speak about water in South Africa, we're bringing in these conversations about the lack of rainfall that's affecting, the manner in which our rivers are flowing, the manner in which our crops are growing, and how farmers now have to navigate carrying water to and from communities. So I can take some time to unpack each one of these, but I want to focus specifically on the senior phase activities. And what I've done here is taken our two little papers that we've looked at and created two short videos around this. Because as anybody who knows, and I'm sure I've got some young people here as well, the worst thing is when your lecturer or your teacher drones on and on and on, as I think I'm beginning to do as well. So to give everybody a little bit of a break from my voice, I'm just going to show how we can take some of these academic papers and make it a bit more relatable to the students and learners in our care.
Sub-Saharan farmers rely mainly on rain-fed agriculture. Changes in rainfall and temperature negatively affect crop growth. Farmers who cannot sustain their farms often end up having to move to urban areas. These areas may be overcrowded and competition for jobs and resources is high. The poor crop yields has led to an increase in food prices, so the farmers have to buy the food they once produced for themselves, often at a higher cost. The surge of people to urban areas makes it difficult for governments to adequately plan infrastructure. There is also an increase in resource consumption and pollution, both of which contribute to climate change. In Sub-Saharan Africa, climate change leads to debt, poverty, and uncertainty of the future. Greater awareness is needed so that communities, policymakers, and international stakeholders can implement sustainable solutions, support adaptation strategies, and invest in resilient agricultural systems to secure livelihoods and ensure food security in the face of a changing climate.
So that's just a little way in which to showcase some of these things in a much more approachable way. And it helps for children to see these visuals, especially because now they can make links to what is being said, and it just sticks in the memory a little better than when your teacher talks on and on and on. So what I would do with a video like this is to either use this as an English resource, where I would now showcase this as a little visual comprehension, or I would go straight into my geography lesson and incorporate it there. So I've actually extracted some small parts of this curriculum of ours and shown how, in fact, I would use that video in order to have little tips and areas and discussion points where children can now start talking about these things within our educational context. So the subtopic that I'm looking at here is settlement with a focus on South Africa. The recommended resources is the use of maps, photographs to illustrate different kinds of settlements, information from community members and elders, and stories and case studies that illustrate the conditions caused by urbanization. So this would fall into the category of stories and case studies. So without going too far into the concepts of urbanization and so on, I would then highlight certain areas here. Firstly, as we've spoken about in this session, why people are moving to urban areas. And this discussion that now would be sparked is, on the one hand, it could be a choice. So many young people feel that there are more opportunities, they are moving to urban areas to pursue studies, and there's nothing wrong with that. But there are some people for whom this isn't a choice. They're being forced to leave their families behind and go to these urban areas in search of food and jobs and resources. Highlighting again there that now you're sitting with a situation of being in an urban area and purchasing at a shop the very food that you grew for yourself. So this now links us to how is climate change forcing people to move to urban areas? One simple question within these 5 hours that I have in which to grapple with the topic, but it now highlights again how it's not just this theoretical thing of climate change. It's not a mythical monster or something that is global and doesn't relate to children sitting in the classroom. For a lot of children in Sub-Saharan Africa, the reality is that they face circumstances some of us can't even imagine. And to sit in a classroom of 40, 45, 50 upwards, and you're not sure where your next meal is coming from, it can sometimes be difficult to now look at something that you view as outside of what affects you, like climate change. So for these young people, it is so important to not only hear the stories from other young people from around the world, but also to realize that this global thing is actually affecting their lives on a day-to-day basis. And another thing that I would then highlight is how can rapid city growth worsen climate change? So we're looking at issues, as is highlighted in that little curriculum document, of housing and service provision. We're looking at healthcare and education. And again, how a strain on building rapidly means we can't plot and plan our infrastructure the way that adds to sustainability. We also might end up using materials that might be harmful to the environment in the long run, but because there's such an urgent need, we're looking at short-term gain and not considering the long-term loss. So these are areas that I would touch on if we was looking at this specific data-driven information. So I've done something similar with the next presentation using our case study. And I'm going to highlight that for us. And then we're again going to look at how we take a curriculum document and what are some of the small talking points that we can use in order to highlight climate change within our classrooms without making it too difficult for teachers, without adding to this burden that they already have to provide quality education to children. So let's just have a look at that second video.
Climate change is making it harder for the people in Enyazan, KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa. The area is having more problems like droughts and very hot weather, which make it tough to grow crops and find enough water. In addition, the nighttime temperatures have experienced a sharp decline, which is affecting the livestock. Many men have moved to urban areas in search of work. The remaining community members are trying to find ways to deal with these problems. They are planting different kinds of crops, using stronger plants that can handle tougher weather, and utilizing traditional knowledge. For example, when the low temperatures affected egg production, they used makeshift steel drum fires and stone bricks to create warmer chicken coops. The community also believes in standing alongside each other and sharing resources. By working together and incorporating traditional knowledge, the community members have managed to secure their short-term future. However, it is only through addressing climate change issues that long-term security and growth can be achieved.
So again, it's a very relatable, very short 1-minute summary of some of the more academic things that we discussed. But it is important to take these concepts and bring it down to the level where children can understand them better. So what I would look at here, and again, extracting from the document, as I've said. So this is now a grade 9 curriculum document. The previous one was for our grade 8s. So we're looking at about 13, 14 years in age. And this specific topic is resource and sustainability. And here, this concept of food security, using local, regional, and global examples come into play. We're looking at the role of science and technology in food production. We're looking at factory farming, which is when we raise livestock at high density. and even touching on genetically modified crops when we're looking at sustainable farming. So the curriculum is actually beautifully mapped out with opportunities to incorporate climate change. And it's important that teachers don't think because it's not overtly mentioned that they can just shy away from it. So there is a little bit of responsibility on adults to highlight and showcase this, because at the end of the day, it's not something that the youth is responsible for. They've kind of inherited this problem. And if we don't start giving them the tools with which they can make better choices, then I don't think there's going to be a quick solution at all. And again, I'm really inspired by some of the talks and the young people that I have seen on this presentation so far. So in my little classroom, what I would have done next is look at food security with a little bit of a deeper lens. Specifically, how does climate change affect food security? So now we're moving away from these crop yields and agricultural aspects and looking at how it affects the people themselves. So we could touch on these concepts of hunger and poverty. We would definitely look at the right to food and how it is that some people can be expected to function and produce and study and work, but this core area of their lives has not been met. And a very fascinating topic that I would encourage you to spend some time on is science and technology versus traditional methods, which is better? And I very specifically put this term better in inverted commas, because I'm hoping that from a discussion, there can then be highlights of the importance of honoring traditional methods. We're looking at this example of the makeshift fires that were made in the community in KwaZulu-Natal because they did not have access to incubators. So that's traditional knowledge that's been passed on through the community that's now being used in new and innovative ways. And that's a very key point that I don't think it's important for technology to be thrown at a problem, but for stakeholders to come together and say, how can we utilize and help a community where they are with what they have in order to have better security? Often there are infrastructure that gets put in place, but it's not sustainable. Because what happens when some of these systems break down? How do they now have access to the technology and tools to fix them? So it's really important that our young children realize and honor indigenous and traditional methods where they can be used for the good of a community. And then how does climate change affect sustainable farming would be one of my next questions. As I've said, it's not going to be beneficial to have a system in place where there's a short-term benefit, but in the long run, it's not sustainable. So there's that expression of giving a man a fish and teaching him to fish, whereas are you helping these communities in the short term, or are you actually giving them things that can promote long-term food security as well as stability within that country? It goes without saying that when there's a shortage in food, there's going to be an increase in crime, there's going to be conflict. And it's really important that we acknowledge that and that we look at climate change as something that is impacting that cycle of poverty. And again, that we look at the needs of the community itself and not just what we think they need, but actually have open discourse with these communities as to how we can assist them. So that wraps up the presentation aspect. I'm going to move away from this screen. I do have all the links to the papers that I have referenced here, and the little videos are just my own creations. So I'm hoping that there are some little questions or some discourse and panels that we can look at in order to open up some kind of discussion I'm not sure if there is anybody that would like to share anything before we end of this session. So I'm not seeing anything popping up on the chats. Okay, so I think that is going to be the end of the session for this evening. The sun has set very quickly here in South Africa. So I am hoping that the rest of the sessions go very well and that there are some good takeaways that you can take from the session. And please do continue the debate and the discussion around the issue. It's really important to highlight, as I've said, the fact that many of these people who are affected have limited access and means by which they can address the issues. I've got a question. What are you seeing as the main challenge for teachers teaching about climate change? Beautiful question. I think if anybody has come from a teaching background, I taught for many years, and if you are sitting with overcrowded classrooms and a very packed curriculum, teachers often have to be teachers, caregivers. They feed children. They look after the emotional needs of children. And the one thing that might be difficult is looking at something like climate change and feeling it's another thing. It's an added burden that now has to be addressed. The teacher would have to do their own research or put together their own presentations or find time somewhere in the curriculum. The children aren't going to be interested. So that's why I very specifically wanted to highlight how by a very quick mapping of your curriculum, you can highlight key areas where you have little buzzwords and questions that you could just throw in order to promote the conversation. And again, that is the biggest starting point, is promoting the thinking and conversation so that our young children can be inspired. I'm hoping that answered your question.